Welcome to an exploration of a silent yet pervasive flaw that distorts human decisions and undermines justice, health, and organizational efficiency. While our collective conversations have long been captivated by the star of the show, systematic psychological bias, there is a second, far more elusive component of error that operates quietly offstage. This hidden variable is noise, the unwanted, random variability in judgments that should ideally be identical. Wherever human beings are called upon to make a decision, be it a doctor diagnosing a patient, a judge determining a criminal sentence, an underwriter pricing an insurance risk, or a manager selecting a candidate, the human mind acts as an imperfect measuring instrument. We live under the comfortable illusion of agreement, mistakenly believing that others see the world exactly as we do. Yet, when we turn over the target to look at the scatter of our choices, we find a staggering degree of divergence. This work is an intellectual crusade and a practical guide designed to make this invisible enemy visible. By exploring the psychological underpinnings of why our minds drift, how group dynamics amplify our errors, and how simple, rule-based systems consistently outperform human intuition, this narrative provides the ultimate blueprint for decision hygiene. The goal is not to turn humanity into unfeeling machines, but to reclaim fairness, protect economic security, and achieve a higher standard of accuracy in an uncertain world. Let us begin the journey toward a less noisy world. Chapter 1. The Hidden Flaw. Picture a shooting arcade where 4 distinct groups take their turns at the firing line. Each squad has 5 individuals sharing a single rifle, and every person takes exactly 1 shot. In a flawless execution of skill, every round would pierce the absolute center of the target. For the first group, this is nearly the reality. Their shots form a tight, overlapping cluster directly over the bullseye. They are both accurate and precise. When the second group steps up, their shots are also tightly clustered, but they strike the upper right quadrant, completely missing the center. This squad exhibits a systematic deviation. Because their error is consistent, it is entirely predictable. If a 6th member were to fire, you could safely bet the shot would land in that same upper right area. We can easily imagine a clear cause for this collective failure. Perhaps the rifle's sight is visibly bent. This is bias. The third group takes the rifle, and their results tell a completely different story. Their 5 shots are scattered wildly across the entire paper. Some hit high, some low, some left, some right. The impacts are roughly centered around the bullseye, meaning there is no systematic deviation, but the sheer spread of the holes makes the outcome of any future shot entirely unpredictable. There is no obvious explanation for this wide dispersal, other than the uncomfortable reality that these individuals are simply poor marksmen. This scatter, this erratic and unpredictable divergence, is noise. Finally, the 4th group fires, and their target is a mess of both errors. The shots are widely scattered, and the entire erratic grouping is centered far away from the bullseye. They are afflicted by both bias and noise. This shooting range is not merely an illustration of marksmanship, it is a vital metaphor for the profound failures within human judgment. When professionals make critical decisions on behalf of society or massive organizations, their judgments often fall victim to these exact same patterns of error. Some decisions are heavily biased, missing the mark in a consistent and systematic direction. But many others are deeply noisy. Professionals who are theoretically interchangeable, possessing the same training and operating under the same rules, frequently scatter their judgments across a wide and unpredictable spectrum. Unfortunately, many of our most vital institutions resemble the 4th group, plagued simultaneously by systemic bias and rampant noise. There is a fundamental difference between these 2 types of error, and it can be understood by imagining the targets from the arcade turned entirely around. If you were permitted to look only at the blank back of the paper without ever seeing where the bullseye was printed on the front, you would not be able to identify which team was biased. Without the true target as a reference point, the tightly clustered shots of the 1st and 2nd groups would look identical. However, even from the back of the paper, the 3rd and 4th groups are instantly recognizable. The wide, erratic scatter of their shots is undeniable. This reveals a profound truth about human error. You can identify and measure noise even when you have absolutely no idea what the correct answer was supposed to be. To fully grasp the magnitude of human error, we must reckon with both of these forces. Yet, in our collective discourse, bias dominates the conversation. It is the subject of endless academic research, popular literature, and corporate training. Noise, on the other hand, operates offstage, largely ignored and rarely measured. But in the real world, the sheer volume of noise is scandalous. In medicine, different physicians presented with the identical patient will return wildly different diagnoses for conditions ranging from heart disease to depression. In child protection agencies, the decision to remove a child from a home frequently depends more on the personal tendencies of the randomly assigned caseworker than on the actual danger present in the household. In immigration courts, whether a desperate person is granted asylum or deported to face persecution often resembles a game of roulette dictated by the identity of the judge rather than the merits of the case. Forensic scientists examining the same fingerprints and patent examiners reviewing the same technical applications routinely demonstrate staggering variability. Wherever human judgment is required, noise is present, and it exerts a heavy toll. To see the devastating impact of this hidden flaw, we must step into the courtroom. Consider the fate of a person convicted of a crime, whether it be fraud, assault, or theft. The penalty they suffer should be a reflection of their actions and their history, not the mood of the magistrate, the temperature outside, or the luck of the judicial draw. Yet, throughout history and across the globe, judges have wielded immense, largely unchecked discretion. For decades, this open-ended authority was celebrated as the pinnacle of a humane justice system, supposedly allowing wise jurists to tailor punishments to the unique soul of the defendant. But in the 1970s, the illusion of this benevolent discretion was shattered by a fierce jurist named Marvin Frankel. Before taking the bench, Frankel had been a relentless advocate for human rights, and he brought that fierce moral clarity to his observations of the federal courts. He was appalled by what he witnessed. He noted that a defendant convicted of bank robbery might face a penalty ranging anywhere from probation to decades behind bars. The determining factor in the length of the sentence was rarely the nuance of the crime. It was the identity, the temperament, and the idiosyncrasies of the specific judge who happened to pull the file. Frankel pointed to devastating examples. Two men, both first-time offenders, convicted of cashing forged checks for minuscule amounts. One received 30 days in jail, the other was condemned to 15 years. Frankel denounced these disparities as arbitrary cruelties. He demanded a system governed by objective laws, not by the personal edicts of men. He called for detailed, numerical checklists to grade offenses, heavily restricting the power of the bench. While his initial arguments were largely anecdotal, they triggered a wave of rigorous empirical studies that proved his darkest suspicions. In sweeping experiments where dozens of active federal judges were given identical case files to review, the absence of consensus was absolute. For an identical extortion case, one judge demanded 20 years in prison and a massive fine, while another sitting in a similar courtroom suggested a mere 3 years and no financial penalty at all. These controlled experiments likely understated the true chaos of the actual justice system. In real courtrooms, judges are bombarded with irrelevant variables that subtly hijack their reasoning. Research has demonstrated that parole boards are significantly more severe right before a meal break, when they are hungry and depleted. Judges hand down harsher sentences on Mondays following a weekend loss by the local football team. They are less likely to grant asylum on days when the weather is unusually hot. Driven by this overwhelming evidence of systemic roulette, the United States Congress eventually passed the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, establishing mandatory guidelines that severely restricted judicial discretion. The impact was immediate and measurable. The variance in punishments handed down by different judges for identical crimes plummeted. The guidelines effectively muffled the noise. Yet the pushback was ferocious. Judges and legal scholars revolted, arguing that the rigid matrices stripped the humanity from the courtroom, forcing them to treat complex individuals as mere data points on a grid. The mandatory nature of these rules was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court, rendering them merely advisory. Almost immediately, the disparities surged back. The return of judicial discretion meant the return of profound inequity, proving that while judgment is incredibly difficult, the refusal to constrain it results in a system where justice is dictated by a roll of the dice. The devastation of unwanted variability is not confined to the public sector. It wreaks silent havoc within private enterprise as well. Consider the inner workings of a massive insurance corporation. In such an organization, legions of highly trained professionals are authorized to make critical financial decisions on behalf of the company. Underwriters analyze complex corporate risks to determine the exact premium a client should pay, while claims adjusters evaluate the aftermath of accidents and disasters to determine the financial reserve the company must set aside to cover the ultimate payout. When a complex new policy needs to be priced, the file is handed to an underwriter. The specific individual assigned to the task is essentially chosen by a lottery of availability. The final number they generate carries massive consequences. If the premium is priced too high, the client will take their lucrative business to a competitor. If it is priced too low, the company assumes a dangerous risk without adequate compensation. Somewhere in the middle lies the optimal, highly profitable price. To uncover the true consistency of these professionals, an experiment was designed, a comprehensive noise audit. Executive leadership was asked to predict the level of disagreement they expected to find if two highly qualified underwriters evaluated the exact same risk file. The overwhelming consensus among the leadership was that the difference would be 10% or less. They believed that while subjective judgment allows for some minor variation, their rigorous training and shared corporate culture ensured a tight alignment of thought. The results of the audit shattered this comforting illusion. The median difference between two underwriters assessing the identical file was not 10%. It was a staggering 55%. If one expert determined the appropriate premium was roughly $10,000, a colleague sitting at the next desk over, looking at the exact same data, was quoting over $15,000. The claims adjusters demonstrated a similar massive divergence. When presented with these findings, the executives realized that this invisible scatter was costing the corporation hundreds of millions of dollars annually in lost business and underpriced risk. How could an organization hemorrhage such vast sums without anyone noticing? The answer lies in the illusion of agreement. Professionals operating within the same firm, using the same terminology and following the same broad directives, naturally assume that their peers see the world exactly as they do. As they gain experience and face fewer challenges from supervisors, their confidence in their own subjective intuition solidifies. They mistake their own increasing fluency for objective accuracy. Furthermore, organizations inherently dislike conflict. Corporate cultures frequently design their workflows to minimize direct disagreement, isolating decision makers so that the sheer randomness of their varied conclusions is never laid bare on the table. They tolerate the noise not because it is acceptable, but because it is entirely unseen. It is tempting to restrict this phenomenon to high-volume, repetitive environments like underwriting floors or busy courtrooms. But what of the solitary, unprecedented crossroads? What about singular decisions? Consider the crisis of 2014, when the Ebola virus ravaged West Africa, threatening to explode into a global pandemic. The political pressure on the United States to slam its borders shut and ban all flights from the region was overwhelming. It was an entirely unique, singular crisis without a modern blueprint. The president was forced to make a profound choice, ultimately defying the immense pressure by keeping the borders open and deploying thousands of medical personnel and troops directly into the hot zone. Decisions like this, launching a revolutionary product, choosing to marry a specific person, or navigating a sudden geopolitical crisis, feel completely immune to the concept of noise. After all, noise is defined as the unwanted variability in judgments of the same problem. How can there be variability if the event only happens once? History cannot be rewound and run a second time to see if the outcome changes. Yet, the mechanics of noise do not vanish simply because an event is rare. Consider a marksman whose hands are shaking. Even if he only fires a single bullet, the underlying instability that would have caused a wide scatter of shots is still present. That single impact is merely one point pulled from a wide, invisible cloud of possibilities. If the president's advisory team had been composed of slightly different individuals, or if the briefing had occurred during a period of different domestic polling, or if the key decision-makers had simply been fatigued from a poor night of sleep, the final verdict could easily have been a total border shutdown. We cannot directly measure the noise in a singular decision, but counterfactual logic proves it is there. A singular decision is fundamentally just a recurrent decision that happens to occur only once. It is still generated by a human mind, an imperfect measuring instrument highly susceptible to irrelevant influences, shifting moods, and invisible biases. Therefore, if we wish to navigate the most critical one-of-a-kind crossroads of our lives and our societies, we must realize that the strategies required to quiet the noise in repetitive systems are exactly the same tools required to protect our singular choices from the hidden flaws of our own judgment. Chapter 2. The Mind as a Measuring Instrument. To understand why human decisions are so frequently plagued by unwanted variability, we must first examine the fundamental nature of judgment itself. Not every thought process qualifies as a judgment. If you are asked to solve a complex mathematical equation, you are engaging in calculation or computation. There is a single, objectively correct answer, and any deviation from it is simply a mistake. Conversely, if you are asked whether you prefer the taste of black coffee or green tea, you are expressing a matter of personal taste. No one can prove your preference wrong, and absolute consensus is neither expected nor desired. Judgment resides in the vast, ambiguous territory between precise calculation and mere opinion. A professional judgment is an evaluation made in a domain where absolute certainty is impossible, yet where the ultimate goal is still to discover the truth or arrive at the most appropriate outcome. When an intelligence analyst attempts to determine if a foreign adversary will invade a neighboring country, or when a film executive decides whether a script will become a blockbuster, they are engaging in predictive judgment. The defining characteristic of a predictive judgment is that it will eventually be proven right or wrong by the passage of time. The outcome exists in the future, waiting to validate or invalidate the human mind's assessment. However, many critical judgments do not have a verifiable future outcome. When a judge determines that a specific crime warrants exactly 40 months in prison, or when a professor grades an essay, they are making evaluative judgments. These decisions are not predictions. They are attempts to match a specific case to a set of abstract, societal, or institutional values. You cannot wait a year to see if 40 months was the objectively correct sentence. Yet, just like predictive judgments, we expect consistency. We expect that any competent professional, armed with the same facts and operating under the same rules, would arrive at a nearly identical conclusion. If judgment is an attempt to measure reality, the human mind is the instrument taking the measurement. But how does this instrument know when its work is finished? When a doctor diagnoses a rare disease, or an investor decides to buy a stock, they rarely calculate their way to a mathematical certainty. Instead, they gather information until they experience a distinct cognitive event, an internal signal of completion. This signal manifests as a profound feeling of coherence, a satisfying sense that the pieces of the puzzle have finally clicked into place. The danger lies in the fact that this internal signal is highly deceptive. The feeling of confidence we experience when we make a judgment is not an indicator of the judgment's accuracy. It is merely an indicator of how easily our mind was able to construct a coherent narrative from the available information. We can feel supremely confident while being entirely wrong. Because we experience this internal sense of harmony so vividly, we naturally assume that any reasonable person looking at the exact same facts would experience the exact same cognitive click and arrive at the identical conclusion. This psychological illusion is precisely why professionals are continually shocked when confronted with the reality of noise. They cannot fathom how a colleague could look at the same data and fail to see the obvious truth. When we finally pierce this illusion and begin to measure the errors within a system, we discover that the damage inflicted by noise is mathematically identical to the damage inflicted by bias. In the realm of statistics, total error is calculated using an elegant and unforgiving formula. Total error is the sum of the square of bias and the square of noise. What this means in practical terms is that if an insurance company's pricing system is distorted by bias, perhaps consistently underpricing risk by a set margin, and simultaneously plagued by rampant noise, reducing the noise will improve the company's bottom line just as effectively as eliminating the bias. Yet, organizational leadership obsessively hunts for bias while allowing noise to proliferate unseen. To combat this invisible enemy, we must dissect it. When we conduct a noise audit across an entire institution, such as the criminal justice system or a massive underwriting department, the overarching variability we discover is called system noise. It is the total sum of all the random scatter in the judgments produced by that organization. But system noise is not a monolithic entity. it is composed of distinct, measurable layers. The first and most intuitive layer is level noise. This represents the average, baseline differences between individual decision makers. In any group of professionals, some individuals are inherently more cautious, while others are aggressive. Some judges are, on average, incredibly severe across all their cases, earning reputations as hanging judges. Others are consistently lenient, viewing the justice system through a lens of rehabilitation rather than retribution. If you map out their decisions over thousands of cases, their average baselines will be miles apart. Level noise is the variability we can easily recognize. It is the reason lawyers desperately maneuver to get their cases assigned to specific courtrooms. However, level noise is only a fraction of the problem. Beneath it lies a far more insidious and mathematically significant component known as pattern noise. To understand pattern noise, we must look at how an individual's unique worldview interacts with the specific details of a single case. Imagine two judges who, on average, give out the exact same sentence length over a year. They have zero level noise between them. Yet, if you look closely at their dockets, you will find massive discrepancies. Judge A might be highly sympathetic to young, first-time offenders, giving them probation, but absolutely ruthless toward elderly embezzlers, locking them away for decades. Judge B, possessing the exact same average severity, might harbor the opposite internal compass, offering grace to white-collar criminals while severely punishing youth violence. Pattern noise is the product of an individual's idiosyncratic responses to specific combinations of facts. It is the result of a lifetime of unique experiences, deeply held values, personal traumas, and cultural conditioning colliding with the infinite complexity of the real world. Because human beings are unimaginably complex, our individual patterns of judgment are equally intricate. When a citizen enters a courtroom, a hospital, or an immigration office, they are subjected to a profound lottery. The outcome of their life does not depend on a perfectly calibrated system of justice or medical science. Instead, their fate is dictated by system noise, the chaotic combination of the specific professional they happen to draw, level noise, and the invisible, highly personal way that professional reacts to the specific details of their case, pattern noise. The human mind is a miraculous instrument for navigating the survival of the species, but when tasked with producing uniform, objective, and consistent judgments across modern society, it is an instrument fundamentally compromised by its own architecture. Chapter 3. The Amplification of Error. When we consider the terrifying variability of human judgment, our minds naturally gravitate toward the differences between individuals. We picture the harsh magistrate seated next to the lenient one, or the aggressive underwriter working in the same office as the deeply cautious one. This is the first lottery of judgment, the luck of the draw regarding whose desk your file lands on. But there is a second lottery, one that is far more unsettling because it strikes at the very core of our self-perception. We are not merely inconsistent when compared to others, we are profoundly inconsistent when compared to ourselves. If you could rewind time, erase your memory of a specific case, and present it to yourself again on a different day, under different circumstances, there is a remarkably high probability that you would arrive at a completely different conclusion. This internal, hidden scatter is known as occasion noise. The human mind is not a static instrument, perfectly calibrated and sealed in a vacuum. It is a biological organism, constantly shifting in response to a tidal wave of internal and external stimuli. Your cognitive state at any given moment is an invisible cocktail of your current mood, your level of fatigue, the quality of your most recent meal, the ambient temperature of the room, and the outcome of the last decision you made. We desperately want to believe that our professional reasoning is insulated from such trivialities. A seasoned physician evaluating an X-ray or a judge reviewing a parole application feels that they are applying cold, hard expertise. Yet, rigorous data proves that the time of day and the transient emotional state of the professional cast a long, distorting shadow over the final verdict. Consider the profound impact of mood. When we are in a highly positive frame of mind, we are generally more receptive, more creative, and significantly more lenient. A good mood relaxes the mind's analytical filters, making us more likely to accept a compelling narrative or give someone the benefit of the doubt. Conversely, a negative mood triggers our defensive, critical faculties. We become more skeptical, more risk-averse, and much harsher in our evaluations. If a complex file is reviewed on a Friday afternoon by a professional anticipating a joyous weekend, the judgment will frequently look entirely different than if that exact same file had been reviewed by that exact same person on a dreary Monday morning. The professional remains the same, the facts remain identical, but the outcome shifts because the evaluating instrument itself has changed shape. Measuring occasion noise is notoriously difficult because you cannot easily ask a professional to evaluate the exact same scenario twice without them recognizing the duplication and simply repeating their initial answer to appear consistent. However, when researchers manage to disguise the repetition, the results are startling. The discrepancy between a person's first judgment and their second judgment of the identical problem reveals the silent hum of occasion noise. Fascinatingly, this internal variability can actually be harnessed for good. If you are forced to make a difficult numerical estimate, such as predicting the future sales of a product or estimating a budget, making a second estimate a few weeks later, or actively forcing yourself to argue against your initial assumptions before guessing again creates what is known as an inner crowd. Averaging your two distinct guesses frequently produces a final answer that is significantly more accurate than either guess alone. You are essentially using the occasion noise of your own mind to cancel out your own momentary biases. However, in the halls of justice, medicine, and corporate governance, we rarely have the luxury of waiting weeks to average our own shifting opinions. Instead, society relies on a different mechanism to solve the problem of individual unreliability: the group. We assemble juries, convene medical boards, and form corporate committees under the deeply held assumption that a collection of minds will naturally smooth out the erratic edges of any single individual. The prevailing belief is that while one person might be noisy, a group will collaboratively discover the signal. Unfortunately, unless the group is strictly managed, human dynamics tend to do the exact opposite. Groups do not inherently quiet the noise, they frequently amplify it. To understand how groups generate massive, unpredictable variability, we must look at how popularity and consensus are actually formed. In a landmark sociological experiment, thousands of individuals were invited into an artificial digital music ecosystem and asked to listen to, rate, and download songs by unknown artists. Some participants were placed in a vacuum, where they could only see the names of the songs and the artists. Without any social influence, they judged the music purely on its own merits, establishing a baseline of quality. But other participants were divided into parallel, independent worlds, where they could see how many times each song had been downloaded by others in their specific group. If quality were the only factor driving success, the same songs would have risen to the top in every parallel world. But that is not what happened. In the socially influenced worlds, the initial, completely random choices made by the very first listeners dictated the entire future of the charts. If a mediocre song happened to get a few early downloads by pure chance, subsequent listeners saw those numbers, assumed the song was good, and downloaded it themselves. This triggered a massive, unstoppable snowball effect. A song that became a smash hit in World A often languished at the bottom of the charts in World B, entirely dependent on the random fluctuations of the earliest actors. This phenomenon translates directly into the boardrooms and deliberation chambers of the professional world through the mechanism of cascades. When a committee sits down to discuss a complex problem, the final judgment is rarely a mathematical average of everyone's independent thoughts. Instead, the outcome is heavily dictated by who speaks first. If the first person to voice an opinion is highly confident, charismatic, or holds a position of authority, they immediately skew the reality of the room. The second person to speak, perhaps harboring internal doubts, experiences an informational cascade. They assume the first speaker must know something they do not, and so they align their view. Alternatively, they might experience a reputational cascade. They simply do not want to be the one to publicly disagree and risk looking foolish or argumentative. By the time the third or fourth person speaks, the momentum is nearly impossible to break. The entire group marches in a unified direction, entirely blind to the fact that if a different member had spoken first, the group would have marched with equal conviction in the exact opposite direction. Even more alarming is the psychological phenomenon of group polarization. One might logically assume that when people with differing views discuss a problem, they will compromise and gravitate toward a sensible, moderate middle ground. Decades of research prove this is a dangerous fallacy. When a group of individuals who already lean slightly in one direction gather to deliberate, the act of discussion acts as an accelerant. A jury composed of people who are individually slightly punitive will, after deliberating, hand down a draconian, incredibly harsh sentence. A board of directors composed of members who are individually slightly risk-tolerant will, after an hour of conversation, agree to a wild, bet-the-company gamble. The group dynamic does not moderate their views, it pushes them further out to the extremes. The implications are profound. When we hand critical decisions over to unmanaged groups, we are not eliminating noise. We are simply creating a larger, more powerful mechanism for it. The mood of the room, the sequence of the speakers, and the invisible gravitational pull of social conformity act as massive amplifiers. A process designed to be the ultimate safeguard against individual error frequently transforms into a powerful engine, churning out collective judgments that are just as noisy but delivered with the overwhelming, dangerous force of unanimous confidence. Chapter 4. Humans versus Formulas. In the mid-20th century, a brilliant clinical psychologist named Paul Meehl shattered the comforting illusion of professional expertise. At the time, the prevailing belief in psychiatry, medicine, and human resources was that seasoned professionals possessed a mystical capacity for holistic judgment. The expert mind was viewed as a highly sophisticated instrument capable of synthesizing vast amounts of subtle qualitative data, the tone of a patient's voice, the anxiety in a job applicant's posture, the unspoken nuances of a criminal's background. It was assumed that this deeply human intuition, born of years of nuanced experience, was vastly superior to any mechanical, rule-based system of evaluation. Meehl decided to test this romantic assumption with hard data, and his findings sent shockwaves through the foundations of professional authority. Meehl gathered data across dozens of different fields, comparing the predictive accuracy of trained human experts against the predictions made by incredibly simple, brainless mathematical formulas. The setup was straightforward. Both the expert and the formula were given the same historical data, such as a student's past grades and test scores, or a patient's medical history. And both were tasked with predicting a future outcome, like academic success or medical recovery. The results were devastating to the human ego. In nearly every single domain, the simple statistical formula either tied or completely outperformed the seasoned human expert. When human judgment was pitted directly against a rigid, unthinking algorithm, the human almost always lost. The immediate reaction from the professional community was one of fierce indignation. Experts argued that Meehl's formulas were crude, reductionist, and entirely blind to the rich, qualitative fabric of human life. They insisted that while a formula might capture the broad strokes, only a human could detect the subtle, interacting variables that truly define a complex situation. Yet, as decades passed and hundreds of similar studies were conducted across diverse fields like military recruitment, loan approvals, and parole evaluations, Meehl's initial discovery only solidified into an ironclad law. To understand why the formula consistently triumphs, we must strip away the mysticism surrounding human intuition. When a professional evaluates a complex case, they are attempting to weigh multiple factors simultaneously in their head. The human brain, for all its evolutionary marvels, is exceptionally poor at performing consistent, multi-dimensional weighting. We become easily distracted by a single, vivid piece of information, allowing it to overshadow more statistically significant but less emotionally engaging data points. Furthermore, we fall victim to the illusion of complexity. We believe that variables interact in highly complex, unpredictable ways, and we try to account for these imaginary intricacies. In reality, the most reliable predictors of future outcomes are usually simple, independent, and additive. The formula wins because it does not get distracted, it does not get bored, and it applies exactly the same weight to the same variable every single time. A formula has zero noise. This leads to a deeply counterintuitive and somewhat unsettling revelation, famously demonstrated by the researcher Louis Goldberg. Goldberg took Meehl's concept a step further. He tracked the diagnostic decisions of clinical psychologists over a long period, recording the data they looked at and the final judgments they rendered. He then built a simple computer model designed not to discover the ultimate truth, but merely to mimic the decision-making policy of the human experts. The model simply applied the average weights that the humans seemed to be using. What Goldberg discovered was astonishing. When this simplified, mechanical model of the human judge was unleashed in the real world, it proved more accurate than the actual human judge from which it was cloned. The model of you beats you. How is it possible that a simplified imitation of a professional outperforms the professional themselves? The answer lies entirely in the eradication of noise. When an expert analyzes a case, their final judgment is a combination of their genuine, hard-won expertise, their signal, and the chaotic, transient fluctuations of their mood, fatigue, and personal biases, their noise. By building a mathematical model of the expert, you capture the essence of their wisdom while completely amputating their inconsistency. The model is essentially the expert on their absolute best day, stripped of the fatigue of a Friday afternoon or the indigestion from a rushed lunch. One might assume that to replace human judgment, these formulas must be incredibly complex, driven by advanced artificial intelligence and massive datasets. Yet the empirical evidence points to a beautifully austere reality. The simpler the rule, the more robust it tends to be. Even models that do not use advanced statistical regression but simply assign an equal weight to a handful of key variables routinely outperform nuanced human judgment. A profound example of this is the APGAR score, a simple checklist introduced in the 1950s to assess the health of newborn infants. Before the APGAR score, doctors used their holistic, subjective intuition to determine if a baby was in distress, leading to massive inconsistencies and tragic oversights. Virginia APGAR introduced a rigid 5-point checklist: heart rate, breathing, muscle tone, reflexes, and skin color, each graded on a simple scale of 0 to 2. This remarkably basic, equal-weight formula revolutionized neonatal care, saving countless lives precisely because it replaced noisy, subjective evaluation with a noiseless, objective rule. Despite the overwhelming mountain of evidence proving that simple rules and algorithms are superior, human beings exhibit a profound, stubborn resistance to adopting them. We suffer from algorithm aversion. When a human doctor makes a fatal error, we view it as a tragic but inevitable consequence of the human condition. We forgive the doctor and continue to trust the profession. But when an algorithm makes a single mistake, we are instantly outraged, completely losing faith in the entire system, even if the algorithm's overall error rate is vastly lower than that of human practitioners. We demand absolute perfection from machines, yet tolerate rampant failure from ourselves. We justify this resistance by clinging to what is known as the broken leg rule. The logic goes like this. A statistical formula might accurately predict that a man goes to the cinema every Tuesday night. However, if a human observer sees that the man broke his leg on Tuesday morning and is currently in a full-body cast, the human instantly knows the man will not go to the cinema, while the unthinking formula will still predict he will. Humans love the broken leg rule. We constantly point to unique, qualitative anomalies that formulas cannot process as proof of our ultimate superiority. The fatal flaw in this defense is that genuine broken legs are incredibly rare. In the vast majority of professional judgments, what the human mind perceives as a critical, overriding anomaly is actually just irrelevant noise. We see a candidate's slight hesitation in an interview or a minor, colorful detail in a loan application, and we inflate it into a broken leg, using it as an excuse to override the reliable statistical baseline. By granting ourselves the authority to constantly break the rules in the name of nuance, we reintroduce all the chaotic variability that the rule was designed to eliminate. To create a more just, efficient, and accurate world, we must confront our deepest insecurities regarding human agency. We must accept the deeply humbling reality that when it comes to combining information to make a predictive judgment, our beautifully complex, holistic minds are inherently flawed measuring instruments. The pursuit of accuracy demands that we surrender a measure of our treasured intuition, replacing the erratic artistry of human decision-making with the cold, noiseless reliability of the formula. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Understanding. To grapple with the limitations of human judgment, we must first confront the boundaries of our own foresight. When professionals attempt to predict the trajectory of a human life, the success of a new business venture, or the outcome of a complex geopolitical conflict, they inevitably bump against a harsh and immovable ceiling. In the social sciences, researchers have long recognized a profound limit to predictive validity. Even with the most sophisticated algorithms processing vast amounts of data regarding a person's background, education, and psychological profile, the ability to accurately forecast their future behavior or success remains stubbornly low. A vast ocean of variance remains entirely unaccounted for. This uncharted territory is not merely a gap in our current data or a flaw in our analytical models. It is objective ignorance. It represents the fundamental, unavoidable unpredictability of a complex universe where countless invisible variables interact in chaotic, non-linear ways. The most unsettling aspect of this reality is not that our ignorance exists, but the astonishing degree to which we deny it. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. Our evolutionary survival depended on our ability to discern patterns and anticipate threats, and as a result, our brains have become relentless narrative engines. When we evaluate a situation and make a prediction, we do not feel the weight of our objective ignorance. Instead, we experience a surge of subjective confidence. We construct a coherent story using the information we happen to possess, seamlessly bridging the gaps in our knowledge with assumptions and intuition. Because the resulting narrative feels smooth and logically sound within our own minds, we mistake this internal coherence for external accuracy. We march forward confidently, blind to the overwhelming statistical reality that the future is largely unknowable. This profound disconnect between what we think we know and what we can actually predict gives rise to a psychological landscape known as the Valley of the Normal. Imagine a vast cognitive territory where the events of the world unfold without triggering alarm or surprise. When a highly anticipated startup suddenly collapses or an unlikely political candidate secures a victory, we rarely remain in a state of prolonged shock. Instead, our minds immediately go to work, retroactively assembling the puzzle pieces to explain exactly why the event happened. Once we have constructed a plausible causal chain, the event ceases to be surprising. It is rapidly assimilated into our understanding of the world, dragged down into the Valley of the Normal. The danger of this cognitive rapid response is that it fatally conflates understanding with prediction. When we look backward, the path of history appears illuminated by clear, causal relationships. We can trace a direct line from a CEO's controversial decision to the eventual bankruptcy of the company. In hindsight, the outcome feels inevitable. This retrospective clarity tricks us into believing that because we can perfectly explain the past, we possess the capability to accurately predict the future. We fail to recognize that before the event occurred, that single, seemingly inevitable causal chain was just one of 1,000 possible futures, all competing in a chaotic environment of objective ignorance. Causal thinking is a brilliant mechanism for making sense of what has already happened, but it is a disastrously noisy instrument for forecasting what is yet to come. When a professional approaches a new problem, whether a judge assessing a defendant or an executive evaluating a merger, they naturally adopt what is known as the inside view. They zoom in closely on the specific, unique details of the case before them. They examine the nuances of the defendant's tragic childhood or the specific synergies of the corporate merger, attempting to weave these granular facts into a compelling causal narrative. The inside view feels deeply analytical and rigorous, but it is a fertile breeding ground for noise. Because every professional possesses a different internal dictionary of experiences and values, they will invariably construct wildly different narratives from the exact same set of unique details. The inside view invites pattern noise to flourish, as each individual reacts to different subtleties in their own idiosyncratic way. The antidote to this narrative trap is to forcefully adopt the outside view. Instead of treating the current problem as an entirely unique puzzle to be solved through causal storytelling, the outside view requires the professional to step back and view the problem as merely one instance within a larger statistical category. Rather than asking how this specific startup will succeed based on its charismatic founder, the outside view asks for the baseline success rate of all startups in this specific sector. It shifts the focus from detailed internal narratives to broad, external base rates. Embracing the outside view requires a painful sacrifice of the human ego. It forces us to acknowledge that our highly prized intuition and our ability to craft compelling stories are largely illusions of understanding, built to soothe our anxiety in an unpredictable world. When we strip away the comforting narratives and face the stark reality of objective ignorance, we begin to realize that the most robust defense against noise is not deeper causal analysis, but the disciplined application of statistical reality. By anchoring our judgments in the undeniable gravity of base rates, we stop trying to predict the unpredictable and start managing the odds. Chapter 6. The Psychology of Noise. To dismantle the machinery of error, we must venture deep into the psychological architecture of the human mind. For decades, the study of behavioral economics has been dominated by the exploration of heuristics and biases. Heuristics are the mental shortcuts, the rapid rules of thumb that our brains instinctively deploy to navigate an impossibly complex world without suffering cognitive overload. Most of the time, these mental reflexes serve us perfectly well. However, when deployed in domains requiring rigorous professional judgment, they predictably misfire, resulting in cognitive biases. But a critical question arises. If human beings are universally wired with the exact same psychological biases, shouldn't those biases produce a uniform, predictable distortion across all decision makers? If we all suffer from the same optical illusion, shouldn't we all see the exact same false image? The answer is a resounding no. Psychological biases do not just pull the group in a single wrong direction. They actively scatter the group, acting as the primary engines of pattern noise. To understand how universal biases create individual chaos, we must examine the cognitive sleight of hand known as substitution. When a professional is confronted with a brutally difficult and complex evaluation, such as an underwriter calculating the precise long-term financial risk of a novel technology, the brain instinctively recoils from the heavy cognitive lifting. Without the professional even realizing it, their mind swaps out the impossibly hard question for a much easier, related question. Instead of asking, what is the exact statistical probability of failure for this specific technology over a 10-year period? The mind substitutes, how impressed was I by the management team's presentation this morning? The brain instantly answers the easy question and then seamlessly presents that answer as if it had successfully solved the hard question. Substitution is a brilliant survival mechanism, but it is catastrophic for professional consistency. The reason it generates massive noise is that different people will inevitably substitute different easy questions. Faced with the same complex patent application, one examiner might subconsciously substitute the question, how elegantly is this written? While the examiner sitting next to them substitutes, does this remind me of that successful patent I approved last year? Because they are fundamentally answering entirely different internal questions, their final external judgments will scatter wildly, leaving the applicant subjected to a lottery of subconscious associations. This scatter is further magnified by conclusion biases. In a perfectly rational world, a judge, a doctor, or an investor would meticulously gather every piece of available evidence, weigh each fact impartially, and only then allow a conclusion to form. In reality, the human mind frequently operates in reverse. We are heavily influenced by our initial emotional reactions, a phenomenon known as the affect heuristic. If a doctor instinctively dislikes a patient's abrasive demeanor within the first 5 seconds of an examination, a negative emotional baseline is established. This premature conclusion then hijacks the rest of the diagnostic process. The mind deploys confirmation bias, acting like a highly motivated defense attorney rather than an impartial judge. It actively hunts for clues that validate the initial negative feeling while conveniently ignoring or explaining away any data that contradicts it. Because every individual has a completely unique set of emotional triggers, prejudices, and life experiences, the rapid, gut-level conclusions we jump to are highly idiosyncratic. A single, shared set of facts will trigger a dozen different instant emotional conclusions in a dozen different professionals, each of whom will then confidently twist the subsequent evidence to justify their initial, random reflex. Underneath this lies an even more pervasive force: excessive coherence. The human brain craves narrative harmony. It deeply despises cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling of holding conflicting ideas at the same time. If we believe a person is inherently good, we want to believe that everything about them is good. This leads to the famous halo effect. If a candidate arrives for a job interview immaculately dressed, physically attractive, and highly charismatic, the interviewer forms an immediate glowing impression. The mind, desperate to keep the narrative coherent, will unconsciously inflate the candidate's actual qualifications. If the candidate gives a mediocre answer to a technical question, the interviewer's brain softens the blow, reinterpreting the hesitation as thoughtfulness. Conversely, if a candidate spills coffee on themselves before sitting down, generating a negative initial impression, their brilliant technical answers will be viewed with suspicion and heavily discounted. Excessive coherence forces us to suppress nuance and contradiction in favor of a clean, simplified story. The world is incredibly messy. Good companies have bad quarters, terrible criminals have moments of genuine grace, and complex legal cases are filled with contradictory evidence, but our minds refuse to output a messy judgment. We aggressively iron out the wrinkles, forcing the facts to align into a single, overwhelming direction, because the starting points of our narratives are dictated by our unique personal reactions to different details. The coherent stories we inevitably construct point in wildly divergent directions. We do not just see the world differently, we aggressively edit the world in real time to match our different internal biases, generating an explosion of pattern noise. Yet, holding a biased internal impression is only half the process of judgment. To finalize a decision, the professional must translate that invisible internal feeling into a visible, external reality. They must execute a matching operation. They must take the intensity of their internal conviction and match it to a point on a provided scale. Imagine a judge who has reviewed a case and, driven by various biases and heuristics, has arrived at a powerful internal feeling of outrage. The judge feels the crime is extremely severe. But the justice system does not allow a judge to simply write "extremely severe" on the docket. The judge must translate that abstract feeling of severity into a concrete number of years in a penitentiary. This cross-modal matching, translating an emotion into a number or translating a feeling of corporate potential into a specific dollar amount, is an inherently unstable cognitive maneuver. Human beings are remarkably consistent when ranking things in a relative order. If you give a group of people 10 different crimes and ask them to rank them from least to most severe, they will generally agree on the order. But if you ask them to assign a specific prison sentence to each crime, the agreement instantly evaporates. The mapping process itself is broken. What does extreme severity actually mean in terms of time? To a judge whose previous career involved prosecuting violent cartels, extreme might map to 30 years. To a judge who previously worked in family law, that exact same internal feeling of extreme might map to a mere 5 years. When we combine the psychological machinery of heuristics, which pull our internal impressions in endless unique directions, with the profound instability of the matching operation, which scrambles how those impressions are translated into reality, the resulting magnitude of noise is staggering. The very psychological architecture that allows us to function as human beings guarantees that we will function terribly as objective, consistent instruments of judgment. Chapter 7. Scales, Patterns, and the Architecture of Error. When human beings attempt to communicate the intensity of an experience or the magnitude of a judgment, they must rely on a shared language of measurement. If you step outside on a winter morning and tell a friend it is freezing, your friend understands the general sentiment, but their internal definition of freezing might differ vastly from yours. However, if you both look at a calibrated thermometer and it reads exactly 0 degrees, the ambiguity vanishes. The thermometer provides a rigidly defined scale, completely independent of human interpretation. Unfortunately, in the realms of law, medicine, and corporate governance, professionals are rarely provided with a cognitive thermometer. Instead, they are forced to express highly complex judgments using deeply flawed, subjective scales that actively generate massive amounts of noise. Consider the ubiquitous practice of annual performance reviews within modern corporations. Millions of employees have their careers, their bonuses, and their professional self-worth dictated by a simple 5-point scale. A manager observes an employee's behavior over 12 months, forms a complex internal impression, and must then translate that holistic impression into a single digit. The problem is that the digits on this scale have no absolute anchored meaning. To one manager, a score of 3 represents a solid, reliable performance that meets all expectations. To a manager in the adjacent department, shaped by a hyper-competitive corporate culture, a score of 3 is a polite insult, signaling that the employee is barely adequate and on the verge of termination. Because the scale itself is inherently ambiguous, the resulting data is virtually useless for comparing employees across different teams. The company believes it is measuring the objective quality of its workforce, but it is largely just measuring the idiosyncratic vocabulary of its managers. This is scale noise. It occurs whenever the language of evaluation allows for multiple, equally valid interpretations. We see the same devastating effect in psychiatric diagnostics, where the severity of a condition like depression or anxiety is often evaluated using questionnaires that ask patients to rate their feelings on scales of sometimes, often, or always. Without a rigid definition of how many days constitute often, the scale acts as a funhouse mirror, distorting the reality of the patient's suffering based purely on how they or their physician interpret the words. This ambiguity in our tools of measurement acts as an accelerant for pattern noise. As we have seen, level noise is the simple average difference between two judges. One is generally harsh, the other generally lenient. But human beings are infinitely more complex than a single average setting. We do not just possess a baseline severity, we possess deeply held, highly specific patterns of response. When an ambiguous scale meets a complex human mind, these hidden patterns are unleashed. Imagine two film critics tasked with grading 100 different movies on a 10-point scale. They might end up with the exact same average score across all films, meaning they have zero level noise. Yet, their individual reviews could be completely chaotic. The first critic might reserve their highest scores exclusively for gritty, realistic dramas, while actively penalizing big-budget action films. The second critic might reward technical brilliance and visual effects, while dismissing slow-paced dramas as boring. They each have a unique, stable signature of judgment. This signature is not random. It is the predictable output of their specific worldview interacting with the specific details of a case. This is stable pattern noise. It is the most profound and mathematically significant source of error in almost every system of human judgment. To truly understand the architecture of error, we must visualize the total volume of system noise as a large, bounded container, and then methodically divide it into its constituent parts. When an organization conducts a comprehensive audit, whether reviewing thousands of medical diagnoses or a decade of bail decisions, the first and most obvious slice of the container we can isolate is level noise. We calculate the average severity of each professional and measure how far apart they are from one another. While level noise is politically frustrating and deeply unfair to the individuals subjected to it, statistical analyses routinely reveal that it is the smaller portion of the problem. Once we remove level noise from the container, everything that remains is pattern noise. It is the chaotic, unpredictable interaction between the judge and the specific case. But pattern noise itself must be divided one final time. We must separate the enduring from the ephemeral. A portion of this pattern noise is caused by the transient, shifting state of the judge's mind at the exact moment of decision. The fatigue, the mood, the weather. This is occasion noise, the internal scatter of a single mind over time. When we subtract occasion noise, we are left with the bedrock of human error, stable pattern noise. This is the quiet, immovable reality that you view the world differently than your colleagues, not because you are having a bad day, but because you are a different person. Your unique history, your education, your unspoken prejudices, and your personal values dictate a highly specific response to a highly specific set of facts. In nearly every complex system analyzed, from the pricing of corporate insurance to the sentencing of federal crimes, stable pattern noise is the largest single component of system noise. It is the invisible dark matter of human judgment. Recognizing this architecture is a transformative moment for any organization. For decades, leadership has attempted to fix broken systems by deploying the wrong interventions. They focus endlessly on rooting out systemic bias, entirely missing the massive cloud of noise. When they do attempt to address inconsistency, they usually focus entirely on level noise, reprimanding the exceptionally harsh managers or retraining the overly lenient doctors. But addressing level noise does absolutely nothing to cure stable pattern noise. You can force two judges to have the exact same average sentencing rate, but if they are still reacting to specific crimes in wildly different, idiosyncratic ways, the system remains fundamentally unjust. To achieve a higher standard of justice, safety, and economic efficiency, we must abandon the naive hope that better training or stronger willpower will somehow force distinct human minds to operate in perfect unison. The mind is a spectacular engine of individuality. It is designed to see the world uniquely, to form specific attachments, and to construct personalized narratives. These traits are the source of human creativity and empathy, but they are the exact traits that destroy objective measurement. If we wish to drastically reduce the sheer volume of error in the world, we must stop trying to change the fundamental nature of the human instrument, and instead change the environment in which that instrument operates. We must move beyond the diagnosis of error and begin the rigorous practice of decision hygiene. Chapter 8. Decision Hygiene. In the mid-19th century, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis made an observation that would forever alter the course of medical history. He noticed a horrifying mortality rate among women giving birth in hospital wards managed by doctors compared to those managed by midwives. Semmelweis theorized that the doctors, who routinely moved directly from performing autopsies in the morgue to delivering babies in the maternity ward, were carrying invisible cadaverous particles on their hands. His proposed solution was shockingly simple. Mandate that all medical staff scrub their hands with a chlorine solution before touching a patient. At the time, the medical establishment mocked him. The microscopic world of bacteria and viruses was entirely unknown, and doctors were deeply insulted by the implication that their hands were unclean. Yet, hand-washing drastically plummeted the death rate. The profound beauty of hand-washing, and of all physical hygiene, is that you do not need to know precisely which pathogen you are destroying. When a surgeon scrubs in today, they are not targeting a specific identified virus on their left thumb. They are applying a universal preventative procedure that fundamentally reduces the overall threat of infection. We must apply this exact same philosophy to the realm of human judgment. When an organization attempts to improve its decisions, it usually behaves like a doctor trying to hunt down a single specific virus. Leadership conducts exhaustive post-mortems on massive failures, desperately trying to identify the exact cognitive bias that caused the disaster. But as we have established, system noise is a sprawling, chaotic cloud of unwanted variability. You cannot predict exactly how a specific individual's pattern noise will interact with a specific case on a specific Tuesday. Therefore, you cannot cure noise by hunting for specific errors after the fact. You must prevent the errors from taking root in the first place. You must practice decision hygiene. The first principle of decision hygiene is to recognize that while all human instruments are flawed, some instruments are demonstrably better calibrated than others. If we want to reduce the total volume of noise, we must actively select better judges. Decades of research reveal that certain cognitive profiles consistently produce more accurate and less noisy judgments. These individuals are not necessarily the loudest or the most confident in the room. In fact, they often display the opposite traits. They score highly on tests of cognitive reflection, meaning they naturally pause to question their own initial gut-level instincts. They possess a trait known as actively open-minded thinking. They genuinely enjoy encountering information that contradicts their current beliefs, and they update their mental models without suffering a blow to their ego. By deliberately populating critical decision-making roles with these specific cognitive profiles, an organization immediately lowers the baseline of system noise. However, selecting better judges is only a partial defense. Even the most open-minded professional is biologically tethered to a human brain, which means they remain vulnerable to the invisible pull of heuristics and the transient shifts of occasion noise. Because an individual cannot easily observe their own cognitive biases in real time, organizations must externalize the self-correction process. They must deploy a decision observer. A decision observer is an individual, or a strict, checklist-driven protocol, whose sole purpose is to monitor the decision-making process as it happens, hunting for the early warning signs of cognitive distortion. The observer does not care about the specific details of the case. They care entirely about the hygiene of the deliberation. Are the members of the committee anchoring too heavily on the first number thrown onto the table? Is the group suffering from an informational cascade where junior members are simply nodding along with the charismatic leader? Has a premature conclusion been reached, causing the group to actively ignore contradictory evidence? By using a structured diagnostic checklist to monitor the mechanics of the conversation, the decision observer can intercede, forcing the group to pause, reassess their cognitive posture, and wash their hands before touching the final verdict. One of the most powerful tools a decision observer can deploy is the rigid sequencing of information. To understand the necessity of this, we must look at the high-stakes world of forensic science. For generations, the fingerprint examiner was viewed as an infallible detective, armed with an unshakable objective science. But cognitive psychologists discovered a terrifying vulnerability in the forensic laboratory. If you give an expert fingerprint examiner a latent print from a crime scene and a known print from a suspect, their evaluation should be entirely objective. But what happens if, right before they look at the prints, you casually mention that the suspect has already confessed to the crime? The examiner's mind instantly snaps to a conclusion. The affect heuristic takes over, creating a powerful expectation of a match. When the examiner then looks through the microscope, excessive coherence kicks in. They actively, unconsciously hunt for similarities and explain away the discrepancies. Studies have proven that this irrelevant background information dramatically alters the final judgment, causing highly trained experts to suddenly declare false matches, or even contradict their own previous evaluations of the exact same prints. The hygienic solution to this catastrophic vulnerability is not to ask the forensic examiner to try harder to be objective. Willpower cannot stop a cognitive bias. The solution is structural. The examiner must be completely blinded to the context. The workflow must be rigorously sequenced so that the human instrument evaluates the raw, objective evidence in total isolation. Only after the examiner has documented their findings regarding the fingerprint can they be unblinded and allowed to integrate that specific piece of evidence into the broader narrative of the case. This principle of sequencing must be applied to all complex judgments. If a hiring committee is evaluating a candidate, they must not sit in a room and have a sprawling, unstructured conversation about the person's overall vibe. That invites massive pattern noise, as each interviewer gravitates toward the traits they personally like. Instead, they must break the evaluation down into independent components: technical skill, communication, leadership. Each component must be evaluated separately, scored independently, and anchored to a strict rubric before the committee is ever allowed to look at the total picture. Finally, to truly sanitize the environment of predictive judgment, we must harness the mathematical miracle of aggregation. In the early 2010s, a massive government-sponsored forecasting tournament known as the Good Judgment Project pitted thousands of individuals against intelligence analysts to see who could most accurately predict complex global events. The undisputed champions were a group of individuals dubbed super forecasters. The super forecasters possessed all the traits of better judges. They were actively open-minded and constantly updated their beliefs. But the true secret to the project's unprecedented success was how it structured the environment. It did not rely on a single brilliant mind. It took the independent forecasts of dozens of super forecasters and mathematically aggregated them. Because the super forecasters were evaluating the problems independently, their individual biases and pattern noises were uncorrelated. One forecaster might be slightly too pessimistic about a political election, while another was slightly too optimistic. When you mathematically average their independent judgments, the opposing noises effectively cancel each other out, leaving only the highly accurate, concentrated signal of truth. Decision hygiene is not glamorous. It requires a bureaucracy of checklists, strict rules governing who can speak and when, and the deliberate slowing down of the intuitive mind. It forces brilliant professionals to accept that their holistic intuition is a liability, not a superpower. But the reward for this uncomfortable discipline is a profound reduction in the invisible chaos that plagues our institutions. By washing our hands before we make a decision, we protect the fragile architecture of justice, health, and prosperity from the silent destruction of noise. Chapter 9. Structuring Complex Judgments. The transition from recognizing human error to actively preventing it requires a fundamental shift in how organizations operate on a daily basis. The abstract principles of decision hygiene, selecting better judges, deploying decision observers, and sequencing information, must be translated into concrete, practical architectures. To understand how structure can systematically eradicate noise in the real world, we must examine domains where the stakes are absolute, beginning with the practice of medicine. Historically, the medical profession was defined by the sovereign intuition of the individual physician. A doctor's clinical judgment was considered an art form, a mystical synthesis of experience and observation that could not be reduced to a simple checklist. However, as the science of medicine advanced, this reliance on unstructured intuition resulted in a terrifying landscape of variable care. Patients with the exact same symptoms received wildly different treatments depending entirely on which hospital they entered or which physician happened to be on duty. The solution to this crisis was the development of clinical guidelines. Guidelines represent the triumph of structure over individual noise. They are rigorously developed, evidence-based protocols that dictate exactly how a specific condition should be diagnosed and treated. When a patient presents with a specific type of cardiovascular distress, the physician is no longer expected to invent a bespoke treatment plan from scratch. Instead, they follow a highly structured pathway that has been optimized through the aggregation of thousands of previous cases and scientific trials. While physicians initially resisted these guidelines, arguing that they reduced doctors to mere technicians, the empirical results were undeniable. Guidelines drastically reduced the random scatter of treatments, driving down mortality rates and standardizing the quality of care. Yet not all fields of medicine have successfully adopted this level of structure. Psychiatry remains deeply vulnerable to rampant noise. Unlike cardiology or oncology, where diagnoses can be anchored to objective biological markers like blood tests or tumor biopsies, psychiatry relies almost entirely on the subjective interpretation of human behavior. The primary diagnostic tool is the clinical interview, an inherently noisy interaction where the psychiatrist must evaluate an ambiguous, shifting narrative against the broad, often overlapping criteria of a diagnostic manual. Because there are no objective biological anchors, two psychiatrists evaluating the same patient will frequently arrive at entirely different diagnoses, driven by their unique pattern noise and the subjective scales they use to measure suffering. This brings us to the profound challenge of scales, a problem that plagues not just psychiatry, but nearly every modern corporation. When a manager sits down to write an annual performance review, they are engaging in an evaluative judgment, attempting to map their internal impression of an employee onto a numeric scale. As we established earlier, a simple scale of 1 to 5 is a disaster of ambiguity, meaning entirely different things to different managers. To introduce structure into this process, organizations must abandon vague adjectives and implement behaviorally anchored rating scales. Instead of asking a manager if an employee's communication skills are good or excellent, a structured scale demands precise, observable realities. A score of 3 must be strictly defined by a specific behavior such as delivers reports on time and responds to emails within 24 hours. A score of 5 must require proactively identifies communication breakdowns between departments and engineers solutions before conflicts arise. By anchoring the numbers to concrete, indisputable behaviors, the scale ceases to be a subjective interpretation and becomes a factual checklist. This structured language dramatically reduces the scale noise, ensuring that an employee in one department is judged by the exact same metric as an employee in another. This necessity for structure becomes even more critical at the gateway of the organization, the hiring process. The traditional, unstructured job interview is perhaps the most universally accepted engine of noise in the corporate world. A manager sits down with a candidate, engages in a free-flowing conversation, and attempts to gauge their fit for the role. This environment is a playground for excessive coherence and the affect heuristic. If the interviewer discovers they share a hometown or a hobby with the candidate, a warm emotional halo instantly forms, and the rest of the interview is unconsciously engineered to confirm that the candidate is a genius. If the candidate makes an awkward first impression, the interviewer spends the next 30 minutes hunting for flaws. To eliminate this chaos, hiring must be aggressively structured. A structured interview requires that every single candidate for a role is asked the exact same questions in the exact same order. The questions must not be abstract brain teasers, they must be highly specific inquiries about past behavior and technical competence. Most importantly, the interviewer is not allowed to wait until the end of the conversation to form a holistic impression. They must grade the candidate's response to each individual question immediately, using a predefined, behaviorally anchored rubric before moving on to the next topic. This forces the evaluator to judge the specific data points in isolation, preventing a single, overwhelming emotional reaction from hijacking the entire evaluation. The principles of the structured interview can be scaled upward to govern the most complex, high-stakes decisions an organization can make, such as a massive corporate merger or the launch of a new product line. For these monumental crossroads, a comprehensive framework known as the Mediating Assessments Protocol is required. When an executive team approaches a complex strategic decision, the natural instinct is to dive straight into the data and begin arguing for a final verdict. The Mediating Assessments Protocol forbids this. The first phase of the protocol demands that the decision-makers do not look at the specific case at all. Instead, they must hold a preliminary meeting to define the specific independent dimensions that will govern the decision. If they are evaluating a potential acquisition, these mediating assessments might include the target company's management quality, the integration risks, and the long-term market potential. Once these independent dimensions are strictly defined, the team is dispatched to evaluate the target company. Crucially, they are not allowed to discuss their overall feelings about the deal. They must operate in silos, scoring each specific mediating assessment independently. The financial team evaluates the market potential, entirely blind to the HR team's evaluation of the management culture. By keeping the assessments isolated, the organization prevents informational cascades and excessive coherence from infecting the various streams of data. Finally, the team reconvenes for the ultimate decision meeting. The rule of the Mediating Assessments Protocol is absolute. The final, holistic judgment must be delayed until every single independent assessment has been laid out on the table. Only after the executives have reviewed the isolated scores for management, integration, and market potential are they allowed to step back and use their intuition to make the final call. The protocol does not eliminate human judgment. It protects it. By breaking a massive, noisy problem down into structured, isolated components and delaying the final verdict until all the objective data is sequenced, the organization ensures that its leaders are making decisions based on a clear, high-resolution picture of reality rather than a blurry, chaotic collage of subjective impressions. Chapter 10. The Price of a Noisy World. Having journeyed through the chaotic landscape of human error and explored the rigorous, often uncomfortable architecture of decision hygiene, a vital and perhaps unexpected question must be answered. Should we actually strive to eliminate all noise? The pursuit of a perfectly noiseless environment, while mathematically appealing, collides violently with the messy realities of economics, human psychology, and moral philosophy. The harsh truth is that noise reduction is rarely free. It carries significant costs, and in some domains, those costs may actually outweigh the benefits of precision. This introduces the concept of optimal noise, the understanding that an organization or a society must carefully calculate exactly how much unwanted variability it is willing to tolerate. The most immediate cost of eradicating noise is financial and administrative. To implement rigorous decision hygiene, an organization must fundamentally slow down its operations. Conducting deep noise audits, building comprehensive mediating assessments, and breaking complex decisions into strictly sequenced, isolated components requires a massive investment of time and capital. For high-stakes environments, like pricing a billion-dollar corporate acquisition, diagnosing a fatal disease, or sentencing a federal crime, this investment is undoubtedly necessary. The cost of a noisy error in these domains is catastrophic. But what about the endless stream of low-stakes decisions made every day? If a company requires its managers to use a rigid, multi-hour checklist to approve a $50 expense report, the administrative burden destroys the value of the transaction. In such cases, tolerating a certain amount of noise is simply good business. The organization accepts that some managers will be slightly too generous and others slightly too strict, because the alternative, a sprawling, perfectly noiseless bureaucracy, is economically paralyzing. Beyond the financial spreadsheet, the relentless drive to eliminate noise frequently triggers a profound psychological cost, the demoralization of the workforce. When seasoned professionals are stripped of their discretion and forced to operate within the strict confines of algorithms and rigid guidelines, they often experience a deep sense of alienation. A brilliant physician forced to simply click through a mandatory software diagnostic, or a veteran judge mandated to consult a mathematical sentencing grid, feels reduced from an expert artisan to a mere clerical operator. This demoralization can lead to a dangerous exodus of talent. If the intrinsic reward of exercising human judgment is removed, the most capable individuals may simply abandon the profession. An organization must weigh the benefit of perfect consistency against the very real danger of destroying the passion and engagement of its people. This tension reaches its absolute peak when we confront the profound moral question of human dignity. Even if we accept, based on overwhelming empirical evidence, that an algorithm can evaluate a criminal record or a medical history with zero noise and mathematically perfect fairness, human beings inherently recoil from being judged by a machine. We desperately want to believe in our own unique complexity. When a person stands before a judge, their life hanging in the balance, they do not just seek a statistically accurate outcome, they seek a human connection. They want to be seen, heard, and understood by a fellow human being who possesses the capacity for mercy, empathy, and moral weight. An algorithm cannot look a defendant in the eye. A formula cannot acknowledge the tragic nuances of a broken childhood or the genuine remorse in a trembling voice. When a system is completely sterilized of human discretion, it may achieve perfect consistency, but it frequently strikes the public as fundamentally cruel and undignified. We instinctively tolerate a system that is somewhat noisy, where a lucky defendant might draw a compassionate judge more easily than we tolerate a system that is perfectly, coldly uniform. This is the tragic paradox of human justice. The very discretion that allows a judge to bestow grace and recognize human dignity is the exact same mechanism that opens the door to arbitrary cruelty and the devastating lottery of system noise. We must grapple with the uncomfortable reality that to maximize fairness, we must surrender a degree of personalized empathy, and to maximize empathy, we must inevitably tolerate a measure of systemic injustice. Society attempts to navigate this impossible paradox by constantly toggling between the use of rigid rules and flexible standards. A rule leaves no room for interpretation. The speed limit is exactly 65 miles per hour. If you drive 66, you have broken the law. Rules are designed to produce zero noise. However, because the world is infinitely complex, rigid rules frequently produce absurd, unjust outcomes in edge cases, such as penalizing a driver who is rushing a dying passenger to the hospital. To correct this absurdity, society frequently abandons rules in favor of standards. A standard is deliberately vague. Drive at a reasonable speed. Standards restore human discretion and allow the law to adapt to the infinite nuances of reality. But by definition, standards immediately reintroduce massive system noise, as every police officer and judge will possess a wildly different internal definition of what is reasonable. History is largely a pendulum swinging between the two, implementing strict rules to crush the noise, then revolting against the rigid cruelty of the rules by returning to flexible standards, only to be crushed once again by the resulting inequality. Ultimately, we must wake up to the invisible epidemic that surrounds us. For far too long, the narrative of human error has been dominated almost entirely by the search for bias. Bias is a compelling villain. It fits perfectly into our narrative minds because it provides a clear, causal explanation for injustice and failure. We can point a finger at the systemic prejudice or the flawed incentive structure and demand immediate reform. Noise, however, offers no such satisfying narrative. It is faceless, statistical, and profoundly unglamorous. It is the quiet, chaotic hum of 1,000 different minds drifting in 1,000 different directions. Because it does not tell a story, it is entirely ignored by our intuition. Yet, the mathematical reality remains absolute. Wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and more of it than we think. Behind the closed doors of our most trusted institutions, the lives, liberties, and fortunes of countless individuals are being subjected to a silent lottery. The cost of this unwanted variability is staggering, measured in billions of dollars lost, millions of incorrect medical diagnoses delivered, and generations of unequal justice served. To build a more equitable, efficient, and rational world, we must overcome our psychological blind spots. We must stop pretending that professional agreement is the default state of nature, and we must accept the deeply humbling limitations of our own minds. By taking noise seriously and by committing to the rigorous, unglamorous discipline of decision hygiene, we can begin to quiet the chaos, ensuring that when the most critical judgments of our lives are rendered, they are guided not by the luck of the draw, but by the steady, reliable compass of truth.